After Superintendent Talbot and Detective Sergeant Carr heard this shocking story from David, they immediately went to 16 Wardle Brook Avenue with an additional 24 officers, just in case. At the home, Myra reluctantly handed the authorities a key to the upstairs bedroom. It was the only room in the entire house that was locked. Once inside, they found a young man wrapped in a gray blanket, along with the hatchet David described as the murder weapon. Ian was instantly arrested and brought in for interrogation. Here he would tell officers that there had been an argument between himself, David Smith, and Edward Evans. This argument quickly escalated into a fight, which got out of control. He furthered that David hit and kicked Edward several times before Ian picked up a hatchet that was lying on the floor and struck him. Ian would continue that he and David alone had tied up the body and Myra had nothing to do with any of it. Myra supported his side of the story and described just how horrified and frightened she was by the incident. Authorities would let her go. That is until police found a 3-page document in her vehicle describing in detail how she and Ian had planned to carry out the murder. The investigation into the murder of Edward Evans would probably have ended there if it hadn't been for David telling officers of Ian's claim that he and Myra had buried other bodies on Saddleworth Moor. But it wasn't just this that tipped authorities off about the area. A 12-year-old girl named Pat Hodge was a neighbor of Ian Brady and Myra Hindley's, and they would often go to that moor together for picnics. But she would never become a victim of theirs because of how close she lived to them. Investigators also found numerous photographs of the moors in their home. They had a lot of things pointing to the moors, so they knew they needed to search there. When authorities were able to pinpoint areas that the couple would frequent at the moors, they began digging. On October 10th, 1965, they found Leslie Ann Downey's remains. With this discovery, authorities only had circumstantial evidence to tie Ian Brady and Myra Hindley to her death. They decided that they needed to conduct a more thorough search of their house. On October 15th, investigators would discover a luggage ticket that was inside a prayer book. This ticket would lead officers to a locker at the Manchester Central Station, where they found 2 suitcases filled with pornographic and sadistic paraphernalia. Amongst these items were 9 semi-pornographic photos of Leslie Ann Downey, showing her naked, bound, and gagged in numerous explicit poses in Myra's bedroom. Also among these disturbing items was a tape recording. A young girl's voice could be heard screaming, crying, and begging for her life as an adult male and adult female threatened her. Investigators were able to determine that the male and female voices belonged to Ian and Myra, but they were going to need help in identifying whether or not the young girl's voice belonged to Leslie. So authorities called on Ann Downey, Leslie's mother, for help. This poor woman had to listen in horror to her daughter's last moments. But even with this evidence against them, Ian and Myra vehemently denied murdering Leslie. Just like with Edward Evans, they attempted to implicate David Smith as the killer. Both claimed that David brought the girl to their house so Ian could take pictures of her. They furthered that the tape recording authorities listened to was of them attempting to subdue the girl so they could take the pictures. Myra claimed that she only used a harsh tone with the girl because she was afraid that the neighbors would hear her. And so, the couple continued with their innocence, claiming as far as they knew, Leslie left their house unharmed with David Smith. So, it must have been David who murdered her later. 11 days after discovering Leslie Ann's remains, authorities discovered John Kilbride's body. In the couple's home, they found the name John Kilbride written in Ian's handwriting in his notebook and the photograph of Myra standing on his grave at the moors. They also discovered that Myra had rented a vehicle the very day John disappeared. While that isn't necessarily suspicious, it was strange knowing her whereabouts of that day that it returned covered in mud. Myra's sister Maureen would even tell investigators that Ian and her sister shopped at Ashton Market every week. So that would definitely place them at the last known place John Kilbride was. Authorities worked tirelessly to find the bodies of the other two missing children, as well as evidence to link the couple to their disappearances. Unfortunately, they were unable to do either. They could only prosecute the couple for the murders of Edward Evans, Leslie Ann Downey, and John Kilbride. Myra Hindley and Ian Brady were brought to trial on April 27, 1966, at Chester Assizes. Both pleaded not guilty to all the charges against them. During the trial, they continued to implicate David Smith as the killer, an act that many viewed as cowardice and deepened the public's hatred of the pair. Their unfavorable reputation plummeted further, as at no time during the trial did either of them show remorse for their crimes or any sorrow toward the families of their victims. Those who were present at the trial recounted Ian and Myra both appearing cold and heartless. Ian Brady was found guilty of the murders of Leslie Ann Downey, John Kilbride, and Edward Evans on May 6, 1966. Myra Hindley was found guilty of the murders of Leslie Ann Downey and Edward Evans, and for harboring Ian in the knowledge that he had killed John Kilbride. With the death penalty being abolished just 6 months before this, the judge gave them life imprisonment. Ian Brady was sentenced to 3 concurrent life sentences, while Myra was given 2, plus a concurrent 7-year term for harboring Ian. Ian Brady was sent to HM Prison Durham, and Myra was sent to HM Prison Holloway. For the first few years of their imprisonment, Ian and Myra would write each other constantly and even requested permission to marry. But the longer they were away from each other, the more they started to drift apart. This rift between them was mainly due to how they both reacted to their incarceration. Ian pretty much accepted his sentence quickly and settled into his new life in prison. However, Myra continued to maintain her innocence, claiming that Ian and David were responsible for the murders. She had nothing to do with it. Immediately after her sentencing, she began the appeals process and was denied the right of an appeal when the court declared that there was no miscarriage of justice in her trial. By 1970, Myra broke off all contact with Ian when she realized she would never see him again, and ultimately ended their relationship. She would also claim that she was in love with a female warden at the time named Patricia Carnes. Myra would again begin a campaign for her freedom in 1978. She composed a 20,000-word document claiming she was just an innocent victim of Ian Brady's manipulative personality. and maintained that Ian was the guilty party, with David Smith as his accomplice. But the courts were not too keen on listening to her statements and determined that it would be another 3 years before Myra's application for parole could even be heard. Her application was finally heard in 1985, but was rejected, and would not be heard again for at least another 5 years. This action appeared to finally get the point across to her that no one believed she had no involvement in the crimes. No one believed that she was innocent. Ian made his first public statement in 1978, where he informed the public that he did not intend to apply for parole, as he accepted the weight of the crimes both Myra and I were convicted of justifies permanent imprisonment, regardless of expressed personal remorse and verifiable change. After this, he practically disappeared from public eye as his mental state gradually began to deteriorate. Ian began experiencing visual and auditory hallucinations and paranoia, which doctors would then diagnose him with paranoid schizophrenia. He spent 19 years in mainstream prisons before being diagnosed as a psychopath in November 1985 and sent to the high-security Park Lane Hospital, which is now known as Ashworth Hospital. Keith Bennett's mother wrote to Myra at the end of 1986, pleading with her to reveal what happened to her son and for her to help in recovering his remains. Soon, Myra was making front-page news with the release of her full confession. She admitted to the knowledge of and involvement in all 5 murders, including Pauline Reade and Keith Bennett. But she continued to insist that she was not the one who murdered any of them. Shortly after Myra's confession, Ian confessed when investigators proved to him that Myra gave them information that only the culprits could have possibly known. But Ian would decline to offer any public statements of remorse. While their confessions confirmed that Pauline Reade and Keith Bennett were buried on the moors, both perpetrators were unable to pinpoint the exact locations. Pauline's body was finally located on July 1st, 1987, identified by her pink party dress that she was last seen wearing. When Myra confessed, her solicitor believed that her chances at receiving parole were greatly increased by her display of remorse. He also expressed that he expected her to be able to succeed in gaining her release in another 10 years. However, she would ultimately never be released. In 1999, Myra was diagnosed with angina and hospitalized after suffering a brain aneurysm. She would die from bronchial pneumonia at West Suffolk Hospital on November 15, 2002. Media outlets stood and watched outside during the short service at Cambridge Crematorium. But none of Myra's relatives were in attendance. Many local undertakers refused to handle her cremation. Her ex-partner, Patricia Carnes, would eventually take her ashes and scatter them less than 20 miles from Saddleworth Moor, which kind of sounds disrespectful in a way, but alright. In 2008, Myra's solicitor would recall Myra telling him, "I ought to have been hanged. I deserved it. My crime was worse than Brady's because I enticed the children, and they would never have entered the car without my role. I have always regarded myself as worse than Brady." Ian Brady claimed that his right wrist was broken in 1999 during an hour-long unprovoked attack by staff at Ashworth Hospital. He then went on a hunger strike, wanting to be removed from the hospital. While English law allows patients to refuse treatment, those who are being treated for mental disorders do not have that right if their treatment is for their mental disorder. So he was then force-fed, but would ultimately be transferred to another hospital for tests after he became ill. When he recovered, he would be sent back to Ashworth Hospital, where he would ask for a judicial review of the legality of the decisions to force-feed him, but he was refused permission. Ian would go on to state, Myra gets the potentially fatal brain condition, whilst I have to fight simply to die. I have had enough. I want nothing. My objective is to die and release myself from this once and for all. So you see, my death strike is rational and pragmatic. I'm only sorry I didn't do it decades ago. And I'm eager to leave this cesspit in a coffin. Forensic psychologist Chris Cowley met with Ian Brady a few times. He claimed that Ian regretted Myra Hindley's imprisonment and the consequences of their actions, but not necessarily the crimes themselves. Ian would apply to be returned to prison again in 2012, reiterating his desire to starve himself to death, and claimed he suffered from a personality disorder, not paranoid schizophrenia. However, this application was rejected, with the judge stating that he continues to suffer from a mental disorder, which is of a nature and degree which makes it appropriate for him to continue to receive medical treatment. 5 years later, on May 15th, 2017, Ian Brady died of restrictive pulmonary disease at Ashworth Hospital. An inquest into his disease showed he died of natural causes and that his numerous hunger strikes had nothing to do with his death. He was cremated without a ceremony, with his ashes disposed of at sea during the night. A journalist conducted an interview with Ian Brady with shocking revelations into the relationship between him and Myra. He admitted to being in love with Myra, which is kind of shocking in a way, to be honest. When asked about his brainwashing of her, he stated that he did not have a master and slave relationship, but a teacher and student. He could speak frank with Myra. He could place all of his innermost thoughts on the table, where she could either accept or reject them. But she usually almost always accepted them. He would further state that she was just as ruthless as himself. This is just a mere glimpse into the mind of Ian Brady and his relationship with Myra Hindley. A link to the article will be in today's show notes, and it is well worth the read. Key witness to the murder of Edward Evans, David Smith passed away at 65 years old. Ever since the chilling incident, David lived the rest of his life in persecution for being friends with the Moores murderers, and was labeled a child killer. But his wife posed the question, how many more children would have been tortured and murdered if it weren't for David? As Myra constantly proclaimed her innocence and pointed her finger at David as an accomplice, the public believed her claims. Because of this, he couldn't find work, his children were spat at, bricks would be thrown through his windows, and he was repeatedly beaten up in local pubs. He and Maureen would eventually divorce after he was sent to prison for fighting. When she divorced him, she would also abandon their sons. He would remarry a woman named Mary and have a daughter with her. Until his last breath, he continued to help officers in the search for Keith Bennett's remains on the moors. While he continued to help authorities, people were still cruel, believing he had something to do with the murders. Do you think David Smith had something to do with the killings? Or do you think he was wrongfully accused by the masses? What do you think of today's episode? Do you think Myra Hindley's life would have been different if she never crossed paths with Ian Brady? Or do you think she would have eventually found herself in a life of crime? Let me know your thoughts in the comments. Thank you for listening and your support. Don't forget to like, comment, and follow for new episodes from me. Stay safe, and I will see you for the next episode. Bye.